Um, so, as always, technology-based solutions are also being explored in this space. And again, the terminology of triage in this space is really varied. Everything from decision trees to AI has been deployed to try and identify and diagnose legal issues. I'm really pleased to welcome Dan Such, Director at CAST, and Miri Weingarten, Managing Director at the Disrupt Foundation, to the session today to share an update on the Triage project that they're working in partnership on. Dan, please could you kick us off with an overview of the project?
I will do. Thank you so much, Martha. Can I just check that you can hear me okay? Wonderful news. Thank you. So I'm joining you from a park today, thanks to train delays. So I hope the sound's okay. Whilst I start sharing my screen, can I just hand over to Miri to introduce what we're doing, and then I'll pick up and walk you through some slides.
Okay, hi everybody. It's great to see so many people. I think that what I'm going to talk about, or what Dan is going to talk about, is not entirely or exclusively about triage, but it was so fascinating to listen to the different approaches, because some of that's directly relevant to what we're grappling with now. And I think we're probably at an earlier phase than some of the people describing things here. So just to explain about Disrupt, we're a relatively new foundation. We were only established last year. In May as a grant-making foundation. We give in the migrant justice and racial justice space and in this socioeconomic rights space. This particular project relates to migrant rights, and it arose from needs that were voiced from the migrant legal advice sector in different parts of the country. So we were approached by a group in Greater Manchester, by a group in Yorkshire, and by a group in Bristol. And in all of these cases, we were talking about organizations that were already working together to answer needs of migrants in their location. But what they were looking for, what they felt that they needed, was a tech solution at the point of contact of users with anyone in their network. And that's how the idea of this tool came about. From the Disrupt's perspective, the way we approach funding is we generally don't really give funding to service providers only. We usually would only give to service providers who are also levering work for systems change. However, when we identify a need across a sector, whether it's a legal need or a tech need that's infrastructural and that will provide some sort of solution to multiple organizations or types of organizations, then we will try to work to provide some sort of solution. And the idea here is also that we know that in tech, there are huge funding barriers. A lot of times you get an organization or a type of organization accessing limited funding, developing something, but then discovering that, in fact, there are similar needs in different places which would get different bits of funding. And there's quite a lot of duplication. Sometimes there's also it sort of encourages a situation in which there's competition for funding. And so we thought that something that steps outside particular organizations and is owned externally and independently and is built in a way that's open, that different organizations can then enjoy, might be the way of going about things. And that's the background against which we connected and talked to Dan and to CAST about this, and CAST are leading this project. And so I will stop talking and ask Dan to go on from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miri. From that context, it's worth just introducing who CAST are. CAST is a charity. We used to be called the Centre for the Acceleration of Social Technology, but that's a silly name, so now it's called CAST. But we were set up specifically to help other social organisations, particularly charities, figure out how to use digital in their work, whether that's creating new services, thinking about strategy, or ways of organising. In particular, though, there's a real challenge across the whole sector, as Miri said, about not enough funding for digital work, and very often creating digital work that is just for one organisation rather than for many. So the ambition of this work is to create something that can be used by anyone within the social sector at the point at which we're ready. But for now, we have a slightly more focused target, which is organisations that are focused working with refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers, helping them access justice. We will have a catchier name for this work at some point, but until then, I'd like to take you through some of the kind of where we are in the process. The slide's working. So the first is, it's really important for us to create this kind of scalable and reusable product, recognizing that almost every organization we work with has a different approach to referral, has a different set of questions they ask based on their own expertise, their own priorities, or their own needs. So how can we create something that reuses the kind of best-in-class technology that many people can use within their own organizations? And as we've gone through this, we started off with referrals, but it's grown to be connecting how might we signpost people to the right services, how might we make and manage referrals, and how might we share data across the region, underpinned by data security and clarity, but thinking about how we can understand better insights into the support that's being given and the needs of the sector and those who are trying to support us. We go through a really specific kind of design process that focuses on the needs of practitioners and their existing behaviours, as well as the needs and existing behaviours of those who are seeking support. And we're currently through the discovery process, which means we've spent lots of time with people with lived experience, with service users, with practitioners, trying to understand what referral, what triage looks like for them, to ensure we can create something that's flexible enough to support them. And what I thought I'd do is I would share, rather than all of the insight that we're generating, of which there's so much from this session that's incredibly useful, I was going to talk through two things. So the first is this growing set of insight that across this whole call we have, but we're trying to kind of pull together into things that we're really confident that work, for them what we know, things that are evidenced and really well understood about triage and referrals. Things that we think we know, which are our assumptions, which when we're developing technology, we need to test before we invest and we get behind them, and things that we just don't know what work. And the reason I'd like to kind of share some of this is we found some insights that changes how we think about referral and triage. Some of the context, I think, that means that some referrals do work and some don't. I'd like to share some of those at a very top level. So when we're looking at kind of the signposting element, first of all, one of the things that becomes is really kind of clear is how critical word of mouth is in how people find services, how those connections are made, and how relationships are formed. And what's particularly important here is this isn't just something that happens within charities and with the practitioners, but happens within the communities we're supporting too. And there's so kind of starting point for lots of our triages, there's lots of initial kind of links, referrals and triage that already is taking place before our formal kind of triage system takes place. So one of the things we're trying to understand is how we can focus on getting accurate information to people, so that the word of mouth that bring people to our services is as accurate as possible. Another part of that, though, is very often through that kind of word of mouth, and also through the, kind of the initial triage, is that we know that having really honest expectations of what support is available and how it might work reduces unnecessary demand. So trying to understand within this triage process how not only can we elicit the right kind of insight from the right questions, using the right questions, but we can be really clear about what's likely to happen next. And that's really tough because the data of what kind of happens after initial triage is really patchy. We don't know because we're relying on other organisations and their capacity. But it seems to be a really significant problem if we're going to kind of triage and refer well. Underneath all of these kind of big headlines I'm sharing, we've got lots and lots of insight and data that I'd love to share with you. We haven't got time today, and I'm not going to read through a slide with 100 words on it. But instead, if you'd like to kind of talk about this in more detail, to kind of share your learning, your insight with ours, it would be incredibly useful. And I'll put my our contact details at the end. But when we're thinking specifically about kind of making and managing referrals, what we're learning is the people with the greater number of trusted connections are more effective at navigating the system. And what we mean through that is it's not just, again, kind of very experienced practitioners who know about each other, who know what services are available, will know how to ask the right questions, but it's also happening again within service user communities. Now, as we heard in one of the earlier presentations, it's not something that anyone can do. It's people who have more experience, are better at referring and better at going through triage. So there's a challenge for any system that we're trying to create to ensure that we can help people create those stronger connections and trusted connections in particular. And one of the things that's particularly difficult about that is understanding accurate capacity to pass on to other organisations or to refer to other organisations. There just doesn't seem to be very much data that's kind of easily shared about how much capacity any organisation has, because we're always at capacity within the sector, particularly the sector that you're working in. But not knowing how accurate, so not having accurate data or insight into others' capacity There's a real problem in making effective referrals and triaging effectively when you're passing to another organisation. And so that leads to a question about how to share some of that data, or share some of that, not just specifically around capacity, but also to inform wider advocacy and policy work, where there's so much known by those experts within an organisation. There's a little bit less known across the whole organisation, and there's much less known as a whole sector. So we have two big things we're trying to address. So the first is trying to understand increase the limited insight we currently have about what makes a successful connection or referral a successful impact. And again, one of the earlier presenters said, we don't know when it works, we do know when it doesn't work. And that seems to be quite a consistent message. It's difficult to know whether referring to someone else has worked well. We often just know it hasn't worked well because someone comes back to us or there's another problem for us. And then finally, despite having so much knowledge across individuals and across organisations, we don't quite have the data that should be able to show the impact, so that we can use it for advocacy and really challenge some of the bigger policy narratives that are taking place. There's something about how can we create a tool that sensitively, thoughtfully brings together some of that data, so we can get better as a sector at advocacy and campaigning. So where we are at the moment is we've gone through a whole set of this discovery phase, trying to understand some of the problems that sit beneath difficult triage or referrals. Where we've landed at the moment is that we recognise it needs to be a very flexible tool that works well for each individual organisation, that needs to understand people's capacity to refer onto and availability. And if we can do that, linking effective triage and effective information gathering alongside that capacity and availability, then we can find better, more consistent advice. And that's broadly where we're focusing over the next few weeks and months. More specifically, we're finishing off this discovery phase. Over the summer, we'll be testing out some very early solutions. The technology here is the easiest bit to do. It's making sure it does the right thing that we want to test out and get right. But that means that by autumn, we'll have something that should be an open invitation for anyone else who's interested in this or who needs something to help them with their own triage or referrals. We'll have something that should be available for either testing or for using. Now, the difference between testing and using is how confident we can be that it's the right thing. But certainly by next year, we'll have something that others can use. But we're hoping by autumn, winter this year, have something for others to be involved. So if this seems to touch across any of the things you're interested in, my contact details are there, along with Raj, who's leading this project, but is in another session this morning. I would love to hear any questions or comments, but before I close, I'm just going to hand over to Mirid, who I think is looking to round off the session. But thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Dan. And as you've heard, the process is early, but as I was listening, what I was thinking that might be relevant is to just flag the fact of inequality in access to justice. And so when we talk about migrant access to justice, we're not in a situation where there are mainline services where we're helping people access these services. Very often we're in a situation where there are no rights in law, or there are rights in law that are very different from other communities, and there is a big variation amongst the types of clients. And so I think that that's why this triage tool has to be very flexible, and it has to adapt itself to the solutions that civil society have built in response to these gaps. And so what you have is say you're a migrant that comes to a city, you have a archipelago of organizations, and which island you wash up on is a matter of chance. And whether that island is then connected to all the other islands matters. And so the idea of a triage tool that crosses a region amongst different organizations is to make bridges amongst these different civil society organizations that are answering a need that doesn't really have a response in mainline support that's provided by government, whether central or local. Obviously, I'm not saying that for people who do have right to remain or civil status, I'm not saying that services exist, but there is more structure, and so it's possibly slightly easier to think about how to set out a triage process. Maybe the most relevant or closest presentation that came before now was the one in relation to domestic abuse, because you saw there that it's research over the years that led to that list of risk indicators that is appropriate. And so in a way, with migrant justice, there is a similar sort of starting from scratch feeling, where you need to find out what are the right questions to ask each client in order for the triage tree to direct them to the right place. It's not a given. So we're still starting. It's great to hear all of the other initiatives to date, and just thank you very, very much.
Thanks so much to you both. And if anyone has any questions, please do pop them in the chat. As kind of host, there are a couple of questions that I actually have, so I'm going to take priority and ask you both. I'm really interested in the idea of scalability. Scalability of tools is something that we hear a lot. We hear it a lot in the funding community, as well as like the archetype, something we should all be headed towards. What we're interested in is funding solutions that have the potential to be able to scale. Of course, one of the key barriers that we see around this is how we support the implementation of that scalability. Maria, I wonder if you had anything from kind of a funder perspective of how you see your role. You talked a lot about the investment in infrastructure, which I agree is quite a unique position to hold as a funder. It's really excellent to see you guys taking a lead in this space. But also, what if any thoughts you had about kind of how we support the implementation of this subsequent scalable solution?
Yeah, I don't think I have a very clear answer. We're sort of at pilot stage, but I think that we come from two different sort of scenes. One is the funder scene, and the other is the tech scene. And in the tech scene, there is a tendency of people coming with an idea, a brilliant tech idea, and then trying to see if there are people who need or want to use it. And then on the other side, you have the actual scene, the civil justice scene, with their needs, and trying desperately to get funding from funders, where it's quite difficult to get tech funding. What we thought we would try to be is both a funder and have some knowledge, or gain gradually some knowledge of how to do things in tech that are right. And so our general approach would be to give core funding to organizations that are wonderful, and just to help them do what they're already doing, only better. The problem is when you have a limited amount of funding, how do you choose who to exclude and who to include in such an approach? And so that's how the thinking about infrastructure came up. And so what we try to do is to listen to grantees in relation to needs that are not just the funding needs. You know, where are their gaps? And when a gap comes up that's repeated across a sector, we then try to see whether it will have a solution. It might have a solution that's not to do with tech, and it might have a solution that's to do with tech. But if it's a solution that's to do with tech, we don't necessarily say, let's take an approach where we do it small and then we make it big. Instead, we try to find the sort of base needs that are repeated. So maybe it's not the same. Maybe it's 80% the same and 20% different amongst different organizations, but it's 80% the same. And if you can form something that solves that problem, the core 80% problem, and then invite and be open and make things external to a particular organizational identity or even sectoral identity, then maybe people can use it simply as a tool, as a product, basically. And it's not here is my tool, I am this law center, do you want to use my tool? Rather, here is a tool, CAST is holding it, CAST has developed it, CAST has listened to lots of different organizations while making it. Do you want to test it? Do you want to tell us if it's a good thing or a bad thing? Maybe our next version will be influenced by that, and then maybe more people will be able to use it as a product. And there is no obligation. For the earliest users, that's quite a headache, obviously, because then they get asked millions and millions of questions. And so our current partners in Manchester and Yorkshire, we're offering them core funding alongside participation in the thinking process, because we're using lots of their time and wisdom. So we give them a core funding in order to take away the headache and the burden of developing this within CAST. I don't know if I've said that in a sort of clear ways, but it doesn't necessarily, when you say scalability, that's more like, if this works, then maybe more groups around the country will be interested in trying it out. And if it works in the migrant justice scene, maybe there are other scenes that are looking around for solutions and are finding either financial or other types of barriers, and might be able to think about adapting it. But that's, further down the line. Dan's nodding. Maybe he also wants to say something on that.
Well, just very quickly, we've done quite a lot of research into kind of the reuse of technology across the sector. There are two times where charities tend to adopt new technologies. The first is when they've spotted a need and they can allocate their own funding, or they've accessed some kind of funding. And the way in which that's often done is through peer networks. So we'll talk to groups like this and say, who else is using X, Y, or Z? And that means you can kind of pick something up that's trusted by others who you already have that relationship with. So hopefully, if this is something that continues to evolve, we can develop that peer relationship. The other is through grant funding. When people are applying for new projects, they'll say, we want to develop a tech thing. Can we have some funding? And when that funding takes place, then we start adopting new technologies. So we're trying to allocate, trying to identify these points at which people are adopting technology to make sure we can sit alongside there. But the other is, you're right, it's not just picking something off the shelf. It's the support that sits alongside that to make sure it works for your organisation with your specific questions there and the partners you work with. And so think about how that gets adopted is a big focus for next calendar year.
Really interesting. Yeah, I like the idea of scalability as an organic thing that will develop rather than an apex we should be aiming towards. Dan, while I have you, just kind of one more question for you, particularly around the data aspects. We saw there some insights about what we hope this tool will be producing in terms of data. But I think something that's been specifically interesting across the course of this session is this idea of using data to kind of profile or identify, prioritize, kind of index almost need. Do you have any kind of ideas about other tools or resources that do that kind of thing in order to kind of help us with this triage specific question? So I know that's putting you on the spot in the middle of the park on a Tuesday morning.
No, it's a great question. So my sense is that understanding what data can be collected and what can be shared is going to be a really significant part of this work. Some of the data is so sensitive that even some of the people we're talking to don't want the interviews recorded. There's a fear of what might happen to the data. Whereas we have also heard that when we can collect, the better questions we can ask, the better data we can collect, the better support we can provide, particularly identify the risks we heard earlier on. I won't point to anything in particular, but what I will do is I'll follow up with a whole set of links that we've been gathering around different tools to help understand data, what to share, what to capture, permissions, all that stuff. And perhaps you can share that with the write-up from the session.
Yeah, I suppose I could add that there is a project we're supporting within Crisis, which is attempting to use data to inform response on an ongoing level, which is based on improving relationships between smaller, more grassroots groups and larger groups, and making a risk register in relation to the data safety aspects of this, but then having real-time data with analytics in order to respond in a particular place to homelessness. I think, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think the moment data comes in, data safety, data ethics, and GDPR come in as well. And so in a way, I think developing a project on that level probably needs a structured process alongside, and often that also helps then sharpen the questions of what data exactly you need and why. So I think it's been helpful to them to do that process. Could possibly share some stuff from that once it's ready.
Excellent. Yeah, I think we would all really value that opportunity to take a look at that. And it's really interesting aligning these questions around data and accessing users alongside this really clear, consistent message around the need to be able to develop trusting relationships with the communities that we serve, and doing that in tandem rather than it being kind of an either-or situation seems to be something that we need to keep at the real paramount and forefront of our minds when we're discussing this. In terms of moving this forward, we don't have a lot of time, obviously, today, but we do have the upcoming Justice and Innovation Group in September, where we could look to do a session perhaps down around getting people's thoughts ahead of time to contribute to that. We could maybe also pick up some of the ideas that we circulated around sharing some of the learning around utilising and asking for data and what that looks like as well, Mary, from the crisis work. I think the overarching feeling is, we could look to replicate this tool along basically every area of law, housing, employment, debt, other areas of social welfare law. So it would be really interesting to see this explored further and then how it applies to other areas as well. We also mentioned at the top of the session that our next insights and learning session, we are aiming to look at signposting and referring in greater detail as well. So this might again be something that we want to pick back up at that meeting in October. Maybe that would fit down with the timeline that you have around looking at early adoption and how we might support that as well. But given that we're 7 minutes to the hour, I'm going to close the session there rather than trying to fit any more last minute questions in. I do hope that's been really useful to everyone involved. As I said, please do put any last minute questions or queries in the chat. We will pick these up and we will get back to you. But I don't want to run the risk of flagging over. So finally, just to round us off, another great big thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you so much, really, for taking the time, sharing your insights, your learning, your expertise with the rest of the community, and taking us through some of these practicalities of things that we can pick up and highlighting where our collective focus needs to be in order to see progress and development in this space as well. Thank you again so much as well to all you attendees. I really hope you found the session useful. Particular thank you to everyone who contributed in the chat function. I hope this has been a useful tool for you too in terms of engaging with other people from across the community and learning a little bit more about what everyone's doing. As I said, the next Justice and Innovation Group meeting will be at the beginning of September. It's the first Thursday. I don't know what date that is specifically, but we'll send around meeting details soon. And our next Insights and Learning session will be on Tuesday, the 24th of October at our usual time. So that's from 10 to 11:30. And again, we'll be looking at signposting and referral approaches and systems. If you have any further thoughts for content for any of our future sessions, please do let us know. But in the meantime, one big last thank you to everyone. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your Tuesday. I hope this was useful and valuable. Enjoy the rest of your week and speak to everyone soon. Okay, thanks. Bye.